called The Grand Story. And if you're newer here, this is, we're slow tracking through the Bible. We're taking our time. And so every now and then we take little breaks from this, and we will eventually, probably around Easter, take another break from this to focus on the death and resurrection of Christ. But for today, right, we're going to launch into what is a new section of the Grand Story, which is the Davidic Covenant, and which, of course, it's called that because of David, and we'll explain a little bit more. I'll explain a little bit more about that in a minute. So, have you ever wanted or chased after something that wasn't good for you? Yeah. Okay, I'll take that giggle, those laughs as a yes. I mean, you thought it was going to be good for you, but it wasn't. Turned out that it wasn't, right? Maybe it was a relationship or a job, a position of leadership. Maybe it was something that you wouldn't want to admit publicly. Right? We've all done this. Pursued or chased something that really wasn't going to be good for us. And as we head back into this series called The Grand Story, we find the people of Israel doing the same thing when they asked God for a king, an earthly king, to rule over them. And God wasn't pleased with the request. It's not what they were asking for, a king, but why they were asking for it. And we'll talk about that later. And so we're going to spend the next while exploring the Davidic covenant. And it's called that because it's named after King David, who was a king in Israel. Spoiler alert, right? Israel got the king like they were asking for. But in saying that, this wasn't God caving to their demands. A king over Israel was a part of God's covenant plan. And you can see that throughout the Bible, in Genesis and on. Now, as a bit of a reminder, because this is all about covenants that God makes with us, a covenant is both a contract and a promise. It's greater than a contract and it's more than a promise, but if you could take those two things and put them together, it would be a contract and a promise that your life depends on. Okay, like that's how significant it is, how much weight it carries. And so the idea is that you would give your life before you fail to hold up your end of the covenant. Here's a simplified example. If I asked you, said, hey, meet me later today at 3 o'clock, and I gave you the reason, I'd say, meet me later today at 3 o'clock with $1,000, and that would sound sketchy, but let's say it's not. With $1,000, or, meet me at 3 o'clock, I need you to pray for me. Meet me at 3 o'clock, I need help fighting against an enemy or to right a wrong, and you said, yes, I'll be there. I'll be there at 3, with the understanding that if you don't show up at 3 o'clock, not only will it not go well for you, but it would actually cost you your life. You'd probably take that pretty serious, right? I think so. Okay, so God is in covenant with us, and it is a kingdom, and in the Davidic kingdom, what we see is he is establishing a kingdom that will last forever. God is in covenant relationship with his creation. He is fully committed to us, okay? And so real quick, the covenants that we've looked at so far, okay? We've looked at what's called the Edenic covenant because it happened in the Garden of Eden. You find that in Genesis 3:15 when God promises, right after Adam and Eve sinned and fall and rebelled, God promises to save them. Okay, and then we get into the Abrahamic covenant named after Abraham. You see in the trend here? Yeah. Okay, and so where God says to them, I'll make you into a great nation. He says to Abraham, I'll make you into a great nation. I'll bless you, make you famous, and you'll be a blessing to others. Okay, and then into the Mosaic covenant named after Moses. And the Mosaic covenant you find in Exodus chapter 20 and on. It's more than that, but we generally would just point to Exodus 20, which is the 10 Commandments. God is making this covenant with Israel. It says to them, if you follow these, I'll bless you, I'll work on your behalf. So here's the thing is, all these covenants are connected, with each new covenant building upon the previous one. That's why we look at all of them. It's why we're looking at all of them. And so this promise spoken to David, which you can find in 2 Samuel 7:16. Okay, we'll be reading that in just a minute. This is God speaking this covenant. that he will establish a throne that lasts forever. And so for some context, David is king by this point when God speaks this promise to him. Okay, so he is king, and what David wants to do is he wants to build a house for God. He wants to build a home for God, and God basically says, well, you're not going to do it. One of your sons is going to do it. And so God sends the prophet Nathan to speak to Samuel, or to speak to David. It's in 2 Samuel. Wrong one, here we go. And this is what he says. Your house, David, and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me. Your throne shall be established forever. This is the Davidic covenant that God is making with David and Israel, and then ultimately with us. Okay? Up to this point, none of the people of Israel or its leaders have kept the conditions of the covenant. We've looked at that. We've talked about that, right? They've made mistakes. They've failed. They've outright rebelled against God. They've all failed in some way. So the promise of a throne being established forever or an eternal king would require somebody special. It would, somebody that's able to do what no one else had done before, keep God's covenants and commands. So keep God's laws, fulfill the covenant, because God is looking for a king to be on the throne forever. And so that king would be eternal, would be good, would be righteous. He would lead perfectly, because that's what we would identify kings do, right? Kings lead. And so, so backing up a little bit before we get deeper into David. And just to be clear, stick with me, okay? Because I'm just going to give you a whole bunch of information that's it is relevant, and it will apply at some point, okay? So if you're wondering why you're telling us all this, I do have reasons. Okay? So backing up just a little bit. For the 400 years before there were kings in Israel, there were different forms of leadership that God instituted in Israel. There were prophets, there were judges, and finally kings. Okay, and we're going to look at, and there's others, and we're going to look at some of them today. Each one of those forms of leadership was a part of God's plan of salvation for the earth. So we're going to, as I said, we're going to look a little bit more closely at them, because what you'll see as we look at them is you'll begin to see how God weaves it all together to point us to the person of Jesus, because that's the whole point of every covenant, is to bring us to Jesus again and again and again. Okay, and it is just this incredible grand story. And so God had prophets, right? Israel's very first leader, Moses, was a prophet. It actually describes him in Deuteronomy 34:10. It says, "There's not arisen a prophet since in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face." And so Moses operated as a prophet in that it was the kind of leadership that Israel needed at that point. They're coming out of being slaves, and God is taking them towards the promised land. They didn't necessarily know what it meant to serve God. And so Moses' main role, right, is to pass on the Mosaic covenant and to teach them to obey it. Israel needed to know where to go, okay, because they just knew they're headed towards the promised land, but they didn't know where that was necessarily. So they needed to know where to go, what to do, and how to live for God. So they were relying on Moses, who was operating as a prophet, to guide them, to encourage them, and to help them. Okay, next, then what you find, and this is again in that 400-year period, is you find a military commander, and this is the one that follows after, which is Joshua. Israel moves into the promised land, and in the promised land they face enemies and military battles. So God raises up a military commander in Joshua. And under Moses, Joshua forms Israel's first army. Right, again, like they'd been in slavery. They didn't know what it was to fight. And so God forms an army, uses Joshua for that, and leads them against God's enemies that are there. And there's several of them, and so they can take the land. And then after military commanders, we see judges take place. So after Israel has taken the land, and as God had promised them, and so after they get there and Israel had settled, they initially served the Lord, but that very quickly, actually, within one generation, you see you see a moral and spiritual decline take place in Israel. and they turn to other gods. And of course, God, they're breaking the covenant, the Mosaic covenant, and God is not happy with that. And so God takes action, he takes measures to correct them, to bring them back again and again, and that's what judges do. And we see some of that in Judges 2, 11 and 12. It says, the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. They served the Baals, that's the other gods. They abandoned the Lord, the God of their fathers, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt. They went after other gods from among the gods of the peoples who were around them and bowed down to them, and they provoked the Lord to anger. Okay, so to correct them, God sent foreign invaders until they cried out to God for mercy. And then God would raise up a judge to deliver them, and this cycle would repeat itself several times, right? If you've read through the Old Testament, and of course, sometimes it's really easy as the hindsight's 2020 kind of thing. It's easy to look at Israel and go, wow, what were they doing? Why did they just do that over and over again? But let's be honest, we all do this, right? We all have these habits and patterns that God wants to break within us. Okay, so in this, 12 judges ruled over a period of about 300 years. And the Bible even tells us why this decline was happening, which is in Judges 17 and 6. It says, in those days when there was no king in Israel, everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Okay? And so you can imagine what that was like. Probably, honestly, not a whole lot, unlike maybe our current culture today. And so Israel was struggling and having a hard time. And so God was trying to bring them back again. Well, he wasn't trying to. He's bringing them back again and again by using judges. So God's idea was and what he wanted was that he was their king, right? God, Jehovah, Yahweh was their king, and the judges and the prophets would speak and act on his behalf. But the people of Israel just couldn't seem to settle into that. And so they needed a flesh and blood king to look to lead them, to govern over them. And so this is where we find the idea of kings. And again, the idea of having a king wasn't new. God had introduced it in Genesis 49 and in other places. God had introduced this idea, saying to Israel, there'll be ruler, he even says to Abraham, kings will come from your line. And so I don't think it was a surprise that this is where it was headed. Like Israel wasn't like, oh, we didn't see that coming. And in asking for a king, they weren't necessarily asking for something God didn't want or God didn't have a plan for. What it comes down to is why they were asking. Okay? And so so what we see then, what we're going to jump into here, because God had promised Abraham that one day kings would come from his descendants. God had a plan. And what we find in what is 1 Samuel 8, a few verses, 1 Samuel 8, 4-7, we see when Israel comes and they ask God for an earthly king. It says, then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah and said to him, behold, you're old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Okay, so this is another prophet, Samuel. Now appoint for us a king to judge us like all the nations. But this displeased Samuel when they said, give us a king to judge us. And Samuel prayed to the Lord, and the Lord said to Samuel, obey the voice of the people, for they have not rejected you, but they've rejected me from being king over them. So again, God had promised a king. So the problem wasn't that they wanted a king. The problem was why they wanted a king. And it says that they wanted a king to judge them so that they were like all the other nations. And that's the difference. They wanted to be like all the other nations so that they would have somebody to tell them what to do, what was right, what was wrong, where to go. A flesh and blood person. But God was like, I'm the one that tells you what's right and what's wrong. I'm the one that tells you where to go and what to do. And so that's the problem. So God had promised a king, but they asked with the wrong heart. And this works for us in that, we can ask God for his promises, but God knows the intent of our heart. Right? And if we're asking for selfish reasons or wrong reasons, like we won't see that promise fulfilled. And this is what we see happening here. So the problem wasn't that they wanted a king. They wanted a king that would be autonomous, who would do what was right in his own eyes and for them. And but of course, this isn't what God had in mind. God wanted a king who would serve him first. the people. Second, that would allow God to bless, and if a king had done that, it would allow God to bless the nation. It would allow God to defend them from their enemies and to fulfill all the plans that he had for them. So the Lord, Yahweh, was to be the ultimate king of Israel. And the earthly blood king would follow the Mosaic law and look to God for direction for everything else. But the people wanted to be like all the other nations. And that's why Samuel and God are unhappy. Now, the first king of Israel was not David. David was the second king. And, if you've spent any time in the Bible or church, you probably know that. Saul was the first king of Israel. And the people wanted Saul. Why did they want Saul? Because he looked good. Right. See, they wanted to look like all the other nations. Saul was tall, he was strong, he was handsome. He looked like a king on the outside. But on the inside, his character is weak, and it did not go well for him or Israel when he was king. Saul didn't obey God. He didn't serve God first, and so God rejected him as king. And then, of course, that's when God then picks David. A man the Bible describes as a man after God's own heart. David becomes king, and God sets up the Davidic covenant where he says, your throne shall be established forever. Imagine God saying that to you. Like that wow. That'd be something, right? And yet, God says very similar things to us today, right? Such as all the promises of God are yes and amen in Christ. That we have been blessed with every spiritual blessing in the spiritual realms. God says some incredible things to us. And so here's all this information. So what does any of this mean to you and me today? Okay, because you're like, wow, that's a nice history lesson. But what does any of this mean for you and I? Well, okay, as we see, right, a prophet, a military leader, a judge, and a king, and all of this points to the person of Jesus. They are all roles that Jesus has and has taken on and fulfills for us, for his people, for his creation. Jesus is all of these things. It all points to him with the ultimate plan, right, of God establishing his authority, his kingship, his kingdom over us and in us. So it all points to Jesus, it all points to who he is and what he's done for us. And it also shows us how God deals with us and leads us into his plan. So, right, so you have prophets. Prophets, give warnings. Prophets provide direction, revealing the hearts and the plans of God. In the New Testament context, prophecy is meant to edify us, to build us up, to encourage us. Because think about this, the good news of Jesus Christ is both a warning and a wonder to us, right? And military leaders then. So Jesus operates as a prophet, both when he was here on earth, but he continues to speak to us. His word speaks. It's alive. He is a military leader. What do military leaders do? Well, they direct armies and soldiers. It's one of the illustrations that is given to the church in terms of us understanding how we work, what we look like. But military leaders know how to fight. They know how to defend and attack to gain victory. They know how to give orders and when to give orders. Military leaders are familiar with their enemy. They don't just charge into battle without knowing where the enemy is, right? Like, hey, let's take that hill, but the enemy's over on that hill, right? So they know where the enemy is. They know what kind of weapons that the enemy has, and how many of them there are. Okay, and so this is relevant to us because we need to be reminded day by day that we are in a spiritual battle. Each and every one of us, from the moment we wake up, and maybe even when we're asleep, depends, I don't know, but we are just constantly in a spiritual battle. Now, we have a military commander that has already won, right? And he knows what he's doing. So we don't have to be afraid. We don't have to shrink back. We can put our trust and our faith in him, that as we stand firm, as the Bible tells us, that he'll take care of us. Okay, the next one, Jesus, right, we talk about judges. Again, judges give warnings to turn back to God or to continue to serve God. And judges now were primarily for the people of God, right, for Israel. But they did occasionally speak to other nations and to people groups. But they were God-ordained people who dealt with the consequences of Israel's sinful choices, which was almost always in the Old Testament captivity or military defeat of some kind. There's others, but that's the most common one that seems to come around. Okay, and a judge, their job was it can look like their job was to punish people, but really what their job was to lead people back to God. And here's the thing, and you might think, well, why couldn't God be nicer about that? Okay, let's just go back to military commander. We are in a battle. Okay, the enemy does not fight fair. The enemy looks to rob from you, to kill and destroy everything he can about your life. Okay, and sin and sinful choices has consequences in our life. It will hurt us and destroy us. And so God's like, don't do it. And if we continue to do it, and God's like, okay, then I'm going to have to, teach you a lesson. And if we're honest, we have all experienced this, coming under, right, the judgment or the discipline of God. See, Jesus took our sin. He took the wrath that we deserved. He took our judgment. He didn't deserve the judgment that God poured out on him. But he took it to make us right with the Father. But let's not be foolish. Just because Jesus did that doesn't mean that if we then continue willfully in sin, that we won't experience some of the displeasure of God. Okay? And I know you might think, oh, that's kind of hard. Well, yeah, but hear this. It's not about being harsh. It's about protecting you, each and every one of us, from what sin wants to do in us, from what the enemy wants to do with us. We are in a battle every day. Right? And so the thing is, okay, well, I'll move on because we're going to get into this a little bit more. Okay, and then we have a king. Jesus is a king. He is the king. Kings rule. They bring order and civility. They make decisions that are in the best interest of their kingdom and not necessarily for them. They make and enforce laws. They look to bring prosperity to their people and to the kingdom. The king has the power to punish those who rebel and disobey. And a king looks to have his people, it's not blindly obey, but a king looks to have his kingdom flourish and do well, a good king. And Jesus is a good king. And so we are meant to live as God wants us to. The question then for each and every one of us around this, Jesus being all these things, Jesus being a prophet, a military leader, a judge, and a king for us, the question that I would have and that I think each and every one of us has to ask ourselves, because when a king is established, they sit upon a throne, right? That we would recognize that the throne is synonymous with the king, and so the question would be, is God's throne being established forever in my heart and mind? It's a question I think we all have to ask ourselves. He's given the promise. It's the Davidic covenant. I will establish a throne forever. So is that happening in my life? Is God's throne being established forever in my heart and mind? The simpler way to ask it is just this. Is the Jesus the king of your life? Right? Is Jesus the king of my life? Okay, now, here's the thing. Jesus is the king whether you acknowledge it or not. Okay, know this. He's the king whether you want to acknowledge it or not. But your choice has consequences. Okay? right? If you choose to reject him altogether, the consequence is an eternity without God in hell. And that isn't what he wants. By his grace, he has made a way through Jesus Christ for us to be forgiven and reconciled to God, but he has given us a choice. Just like an earthly king, when an earthly king says, here's the law, he can't go around and control everybody, right, and make sure they follow it. But he's saying, if you break the law, here's what will happen. See, God has offered salvation, and he's also given the warning of the consequence if we reject it. He doesn't make the choice, we do. He's made the way, and we make the choice. Now, if you've received salvation, right, but continue to live how you want, continue to sin and ignore God's commands and instructions, you will find it difficult to be encouraged and built up in your faith. That's the purpose of prophecy. Okay? You will find that the enemy has access and influence in your life and brings about destruction and defeat, which is the purpose of a military leader in your life. To prevent that, you'll find yourself dealing with the consequences of your sin, feeling like you are under the judgment of God. And that, of course, is the role of a judge. Now, Jesus has become all these things to take them away from us, but if we, through our own willful actions, live right in a way that God has told us not to, we expose ourselves. Jesus is a good and righteous king. Hear this. I know I'm dealing a lot with what would feel like more negative stuff, but hear this. Jesus is a good and righteous king. He doesn't make the choice. We make it. And as a good king, he actually wants to help us. He wants to protect us. But as a good king, he also allows us to choose. And the reason he allows us to choose is because as a good king, he does not want forced allegiance. If somebody forces you to do something, do you feel loving and caring them towards them? Right? Do you feel like worshiping them and serving them? Of course not, right? You might be doing the action on the outside, but the inside, your heart is hard, and you maybe hate them. God is not looking for forced allegiance. He's looking for hearts and minds that are fully committed to him as king and to his kingdom. So, when we make Jesus the king, the ruler of our life, we will find that he will encourage us and build us up. Again, the role of a prophet. We'll do better in life. He will help us. We will find that God will warn us when the enemy's at work, and he'll protect us and shield us. Right? He is a shield. He is the defender. He is our hiding place. And so he will operate that way for us because he has already defeated the enemy. Okay? He will protect us. He will. He's already fought and won the war. Jesus leads perfectly, so we can trust him even when we don't understand. This is a covenant relationship that we are in with the King of the universe. His throne has been established forever. Whether we recognize it or not, whether we participate in it or not, whether we allow that throne to be established in our own heart and mind is our choice. It's up to us. All right, again, does he rule on the throne of my heart? So am I thinking and acting in a way that my king wants me to? Am I committed to pleasing him and doing his will? Is his kingdom and authority the priority of my life? Good questions for any of us. Okay, so here's just a couple practical ideas that to put this into practice in everyday life. So maybe in your home, making Jesus king looks like, right, setting aside regular time to pray, to read the word, to worship. Maybe it's just you, or maybe you do it as a family. Making Jesus king means that you treat your spouse the way God would want you to, and and looking into how God would say that works. Maybe in your work setting, All right, maybe you got pressure to, maybe you have a boss or a supervisor that puts pressure on you to cut corners, right? To get a product out or to get something finished. And to make Jesus your king at work would mean living and walking in integrity and trusting him with the consequence of what happens. And so I would encourage you, right, when you face situations like that, take a moment and pray. Because he's a good king. He's for you. He is not against you. And so you take a moment and you pray and ask him for help and wisdom and courage to do the right thing, to honor him as the king, the leader of your life. And so this is meant to infiltrate every part of who we are and what we do. Let me encourage you. To really evaluate, to really ask, is Jesus truly on the throne of my heart and mind? Or is it just that I'm doing what I want most of the time or some of the time? And then you're wondering why maybe some things are going a little bit sideways in your life, and this is part of the reason why. Now, when we are committed to Jesus being king of our life, that doesn't mean that every area or aspect of our life goes perfectly. Okay, let's not get that wrong. This is about the fact that we have an enemy that is looking to hurt us, destroy us, and work against us. And we are a part of a kingdom there where God desires us to live for him and to fulfill all the plans and purposes that he has for us, to establish his throne in our hearts and minds forever. Okay, so in a moment, we're going to take communion. And consider this. Of course, if you've been in church at any point in time and seen communion, right, this is about us remembering and celebrating the body and the blood of Christ. I mean, in no other religion or does the king die for his people. I'm in awe about that every single time. The king of the universe, right, the creator of all, became human and died a horrible, terrible death to take the judgment and the wrath that I deserve, that you deserve, we all deserve. He took our place so that we could be made right with God, so we can be reconciled with God, so that he could and can bless us and establish his throne in our heart and minds. It's a beautiful thing that he has done for us. And so that's what I want us to think about and reflect on as we come and we receive communion and we move forward through it, and you're holding the cracker and the juice, that you consider and ask yourself. It's a good time. It's a good time to ask yourself that question: Jesus, are you really on the throne of my heart and mind? And if there's an area of my life that you're not, talk to me about it, God. Okay? All right, so I'm going to invite the worship team to come on back up.